Now, at this time, I would like to introduce our speaker, Miss Elizabeth Prevatt. Miss Prevatt, we are honored that you are here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Hi, good morning, and thank you, Jesse, for that introduction. And welcome, everybody. I am so glad that you're here with us today. My name is Elizabeth Prevatt. I'm a Learning Management Officer with the Office of Human Capital Services, Learning and Development Division. Throughout my VA career, I've worked in a variety of settings, including claims processing, supervision, project management, and data analysis. These areas required different skill sets from me, but there was one theme that was unfortunately consistent throughout, and that was my tendency to procrastinate in certain circumstances. I think we can all relate to this feeling of delaying tasks and projects. After all, you are here today in this course on overcoming procrastination. So rest assured, if this is something that you struggle with, you are not alone. And I hope the content today will give you some practical and applicable tips that you can take along with you throughout your BA career. So before we dive into the content, I would like to introduce my peer learning management officer and SEEDS co-program manager, Ms. Tammy Crotto. Ms. Crotto will be monitoring the chat and periodically joining me on camera for some discussion. So thank you, Ms. Crotto. Additionally, our chief, Ms. Cecily Horner, will be monitoring the chat and responding to any questions, and also tracking issues that we don't have time to address live, but we will include in our post-event communication. So feel free to engage in the chat. We do, as Jesse mentioned, your microphones will be muted, but we will collect your questions through the chat and engage in that way. So one fair warning to all of you, during today's lesson, we're going to be giving you a little bit of tough love. After all, when we think about procrastination, it's actually the action of delaying or putting off certain events. So we are choosing that action, and we are essentially getting in our own way. So today's lesson will invite you to look at yourself and look at your own choices. Do a little bit of introspection to understand how you can help yourself get out of these patterns and basically get out of your own way. Stop delaying the work that is before you. So judgment-free zone, as I've mentioned, we're all have dealt with these procrastination habits at one time or another, but let's face this and look within ourselves to see how we can grow from the things that we identify today. Let's take a look at our objectives and competencies that we will touch on today. Our first objective is to identify the factors that cause procrastination. We need to first understand the root cause of why we're choosing to delay or put off certain events and actions before we can identify the appropriate solution to resolve that. So once you understand some of the root causes related to your decisions, you can then select the appropriate strategy for targeting that factor. And that's our second objective today. Evaluate the strategies for targeting these procrastination factors. And lastly, we'll talk about, I'll ask you to develop an action plan, outline specific steps that you are going to commit to do after today's course. Test out, even if it's to test out a variety of options, but making that commitment and really pushing yourself to overcome this procrastination that you agree you engage in. So let's get out of our own ways and grow, like I said. The competencies that we'll be touching on today, which competencies these come from the VBA Leadership Framework, we'll be touching on continual learning, problem solving, and resilience. Now on to our course overview, where we'll talk about the purpose of this lesson, as well as our agenda. We want to share knowledge and best practices with one another and through the information that I will provide about the causes of procrastination and strategies for addressing them. We want you to become proactive in handling more difficult tasks and responsibilities. The agenda for what we'll cover, first we'll go over procrastination factors. So what is leading to your decision to delay? We'll talk about how you could potentially improve your habits. Next, we'll go on to addressing your emotions that could be getting in the way, navigate your thought patterns, and lastly, develop your action plan. So Now I would like to hear from the audience. Let's get a feel with our first poll question that Jesse's going to pull up here momentarily about how often do you procrastinate on work tasks? There'll be 3 options here. So go ahead and make a selection. Do you rarely procrastinate on work tasks, occasionally, or often? And once you make your selection, go ahead and click the submit button, and then you can click the X at the top corner of the dialog box to make that disappear. And you should then be able to see the results in the chat box. Great. I am seeing a lot of responses, 275 so far. Majority of us are saying occasionally. Some of us rarely, and a portion of us often. So it's the majority of us are following uh, in the occasional category, which that's fine. That's great. You don't have, you recognize that you have some improvement to do, but it's not necessarily every single day. If you are in the rarely category, you may have already implemented some of these strategies and you're just looking to refresh your mind on what you can do during those rare instances of procrastination. If you find yourself in the often category, again, no judgment, but let's just take a look. What are the choices that you're making and what are the things getting in your way that are leading you to delay your actions? Okay, let's move on to poll question number 2. Why do you think you procrastinate on these tasks? Go ahead and envision something, a particular task that you already recognize that you regularly procrastinate with. You regularly put it off to the last minute. Keep that task in mind and actually use it to respond to this question. So do you think that it's because you work better under pressure? You want to wait till you get that deadline looming over your head and that helps you really speed up and become more efficient? Could that be what it is? Maybe you prefer to get the smaller tasks done first. It is validating to have a couple of things checked off of our to-do list, but if we're doing that in a sense to avoid the larger, greater work, that can become problematic with time. I'm seeing that a lot of the majority of the responses are saying that they avoid the harder, more difficult tasks as long as possible. We will certainly talk a lot about that today, about how that mental block, how the large chunks of work really help lead us to become more avoidant. For those of you who selected other, if you're willing, place any thoughts in the chat about what are those other factors that cause you to procrastinate. You just don't want to do it. I get that. Some tasks they're boring, they're not your favorite, and you just don't have the energy. That's valid, but we sometimes need to get things done to be a good performing employee, or maybe we have personal goals that we're working on and we've set these goals for ourselves and we really want to achieve them. And how can we dig into ourselves to get there? So some of you are too tired, you don't agree with the task. That could be a difficult issue to overcome as well. I'm seeing some comments here about last minute tasks are coming in with a higher priority. And that is a challenge, absolutely. And if that is the case that you find yourself frequently facing, maybe consider, did you delay or procrastinate on the original task? And now you have this hot task in front of you that you were planning to spend resolving the original task, but because of this new task and your procrastination on the original task, now you're behind schedule. And that is all too common in my experience. So yeah, I'm seeing a lot of multitasking or rework of the original task. Yeah, these are all things that if you're having to do that rework, you can feel resistant to it because you thought it was right the first time and you're putting off doing that correction. because of that. And we'll talk about that today as well. Well, thank you everybody for those responses, for taking a moment to reflect. Again, go ahead and click the X on that poll dialog box if you haven't already. And we'll move on to the first factor of procrastination. Excuse me, we're going to review the 3 factors of procrastination. So today's content comes from a Harvard Business Review article from author Alice Boyce. And what she finds and what she talks about in this article is most of us do procrastinate. We feel guilty about it though, and then we criticize ourselves every time we do it, and yet we continue to do it. So why is that? Why do we repeat these behaviors that we feel bad about? She has found there's 3 common sets of circumstances that exist that often lead us to delay action on certain tasks. So let's review those now. The first factor is the absence of good habits and systems, also characterized as poor discipline surrounding your recurring tasks, your the themes as you look back through your career and the themes the actions that you do on a repeated basis. Maybe you don't have good structure around starting those tasks and executing those tasks. So that could lead you to put it off because you're unsure of how to approach it. That's the first factor. The second factor is intolerance for particular emotions like anxiety or boredom. You know that every month you have this task to complete, takes a couple of hours, but it is absolutely mind numbing. And you know that. So because of that, you don't address it right away. You put it off until the very last minute because you want to avoid that feeling of boredom. That's valid. I can relate to that. Next, and the final factor that we'll discuss throughout today's presentation is our own flawed thinking. So maybe you have had a difficult experience or a failure in the past around a particular set of circumstances. And every time you face a similar fact pattern again, you're reminded of that failure. And you don't want to relive that. It's hard. It's difficult to think that you might fail again. Well, that's a bit of flawed thinking, and I'll give you some tips on how you might lift yourself out of that circular mindset. So when you understand the cause of your procrastination, you can use strategies that are outlined in Ms. Boyce's article that specifically address these various factors. Through these strategies, you can minimize minor instances of procrastination, such as when you don't start a project until close to the due date, and you can just feel more organized and empowered in your own workload. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the first factor of procrastination, which is your habits. This is what we talked about with poor discipline, not having a lot of structure around the things that you do on a recurring basis. Some theories suggest that people who procrastinate are choosing to forego hard work in favor of less complicated and more easily achieved tasks. And that's valid. That's how the mind is wired, to work towards those achievements, to work towards those accomplishments. You receive more immediate benefit by checking off several small things from your to-do list versus investing time into mapping out more complex and nuanced assignments. So that's a valid cognitive rationale for why you may be putting off more difficult work. In this situation, the individual who's making a choice for more immediate reward now and delay of more in-depth tasks, they might not have an established system in place for tackling this more in-depth work. Let's take a look at an example. Let's say that in your work, you have procedures and guidance that are published on a recurring basis that directly impact your day-to-day work. So maybe you're a claims processor and you know that manual updates are published periodically and it's important for you to review those. But you find yourself always pushing off that review until it's absolutely necessary. And when it is time to jump in, you have a different process of going about it each time. Sometimes you take a cursory review, other times you jot down notes about the major change, And in other instances, you get on a call with a peer and talk through how the guidance impacts your work. So every time you're going about implementing a different process. Well, studies show that when you have strong habits in place, it reduces your need for self-control and willpower. Willpower is finite. You can't strong arm your way into repeatable habits forever. It will work initially, but will wear out over time. And that's why we need habits. So going back to the example of reviewing these changes, if you have a regular process that you execute similarly every single time, you don't have to reestablish or think about how you're going to go about it. You have a habit in place that make it easier to stick to this effortful and fruitful process. And it helps reduce distractions when you're getting that work accomplished. So habits aren't something that you can change or establish overnight, but like anything worthwhile, it's going to take time to stick. If you think that your lack of discipline in certain areas could be the root cause of your procrastination, we can dig a little deeper here with strategies on the next slide. But first, I invite you to do a bit of reflection. And this is on page 1 of your handout. If you received that via email before the class, great. If not, don't fret. The question is right here on the screen as far as what we're going to be asking ourselves. And take a minute to review, what habits do I have in place to tackle my most important goals? So go ahead and jot some notes down on a scrap piece of paper, pull up a blank Word document, and think about that for yourself. I'll give you about 60 seconds. Okay, I hope you had some opportunity to jot some notes down. Tammy, any comments in the chat so far? While I invite folks to put any ideas into the chat about what they already have in place.
Oh my goodness, there is so much conversation. This is really a topic that we can all relate to. We've got folks who use their calendar and phone alarms to set reminders to help them reach their goals, about those steps that they need to take to get there. Organizational skills, lists, calendars, accountability partners. It's easier to reach your goals when there are people involved. Checklists, Excel spreadsheets, planners, reminders, setting intentions for the day, being really mindful about that. Alexa, using our technology to our benefit. I would love to have Alexa tell me what to do when I get up in the morning. It's really hard to stop hearing her when she starts talking. Do a brain dump and then determine what's of priority to you, and get a good, I just set off someone's Alexa by doing that, and and get a good night's sleep. That's always important. Absolutely. So many good
Wonderful.
suggestions out there, and so much great conversation.
Yes, I love that. Thank you all for sharing. And I hope those of you who maybe struggle in this area about having structure in your responsibilities, I sincerely hope you can take some of the suggestions that your fellow participants have shared here. It's really with technology, it's so many options that we have at our fingertips. So I encourage you to explore some of those and see what works best for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and at this point, hopefully after that reflection, you have a sense of whether your lack of habits and structure around your recurring tasks feeds into your procrastination habits. So if that's the case, I'm going to talk about 2 strategies now that can help you address this. So the first we'll talk about is related to deep work. So Miss Boyce in her article defines deep work as focusing on your most important long-term project. Now, this work is generally considered challenging, but if you do it regularly and consistently, it makes it less so. And so this is what we talk about when we are developing habits, is making things more automatic. So we can rely less on our willpower and we can simply execute the habit because habits are automatic. Think about the first time that you learned to drive a car. When you're driving a car for the first couple of months, you had to make a conscious thought of which is the gas, which is the brake. And eventually, with practice and repetition, that became natural. You knew the gas was on the right, the brake was on the left, and you didn't have to think about it. And so At work, approaching your deep work in a strategic way with a good method of regularity is one way to approach complex claims or writing complex documents such as standard operating procedures. These activities of deep work through repetition and cueing can become habit. So I know we have a lot of regular SEEDS attendees. So if you happen to catch our December SEEDS session on atomic habits, we went into depth about how to build new habits, how to break bad habits. So you can pull some of your knowledge from that course when it comes to building these new habits. If you didn't have a chance to catch that, you can always view the recording on our SEEDS SharePoint. So just wanted to put that plug in there for the Atomic Habits course. So one thing to note about scheduling your deep work is that it should fit into your day in the same pattern. Notice that I didn't say at the exact same time every day, because that creates inflexibility. And that if we don't start our deep work at the exact same time every day, then we've created another parameter for us to feel disappointed in if we don't meet it. But if you simply set yourself up with a pattern, then things can flow more easily from there. So after I do this, I will begin my deep work. For example, each day after spending up to an hour on email and administrative tasks in the morning, I'll begin a deep work session, which for me usually involves creating and updating training products or preparing standard operating procedure documents, which require a lot of focus and research and kind of synthesis of information. So that flow has really helped me keep that progress steady and moving forward. The second solution that you might consider, if you find that you don't already have a solid structure in place, is to create a generic framework for tackling a new project or a new task. When you jump into a new responsibility and it feels like the skills required are a little bit out of your wheelhouse, your strong suit, it can feel overwhelming, absolutely. It can feel like you don't even know where to start. But if you already have an outline that includes basic steps that you'll need to initiate any new task, you're already on your way. You'll be less likely to put off the new tasks with worry that you don't know where to begin because you already have a pre-filled list of initial steps. The steps that you take at the start of something new will become a habit in and of itself, which in turn can reduce decision fatigue. So decision fatigue, if you've not ever heard of it, it's a real issue. And basically, it's when you're just exhausted from making decisions. We make so many decisions throughout our day that a lot of them are unconscious decisions, but as we have to make more effortful decisions, if we're faced with those types of things back to back to back, our brains can become exhausted from it. So the more structure we can build around specific processes and the less in-depth decisions we have to make because we already have a pre-filled framework, the better we can be mentally. And again, we can delay, we don't have to delay our start if we already have a framework established. So here's a generic framework I'll share with you that I like to walk through when I start something new. So first of all, I like to get a sense of what is the ask from my supervisor? What is the intended outcome? What am I working towards? So that way I know what we're all agreeing upon. And once I have that clear picture, I can then move into looking at the different approaches that I can take to get the work accomplished. And I can evaluate all the potential options, look for any potential roadblocks that might come up, and those roadblocks can inform ultimately what decision I choose to go down. I can also consider in this phase, what additional data or information or research will I need to collect? And all of this information fills into a calculation of how long ultimately it will take me to complete the task. And this basic framework just helps me outline what are the needs and helps me look for a path forward. So consider for yourself, how can you develop your own system? What systems could you put in place to help reduce decision fatigue if this is an issue that you struggle with? If you're not sure what type of process might be good for you, I've got a tip. Reverse engineering. And what I mean by reverse engineering in this situation is take a look in your past at a challenging situation that you faced that you successfully completed. Look at the steps that you took to accomplish that work and see what about that process you can extract and bring forward to today. Now, looking at our past actions are good predictors of our future behavior. So if we take a look at how we achieved success in the past, we copy that pattern that we've already executed, we've already experienced success with, and move that into today, we're likely to find more success in implementing that same process in the future. Okay, so Tammy, any questions in the chat so far that we should address?
Yes, we've got one good one. Sometimes we're not the ones who are procrastinating. Sometimes we depend on others' answers or guidance, and we're forced to procrastinate. So we have to rely on others sometimes in their timing. And what do we do to fix that? How do we help?
That is a valid point. And when we're working and we rely on others, which is so much of what we do in our processes here at BA, is for working on a project, there's always other project team members who we rely on their expertise to feed into our work. And again, that I wouldn't call that procrastination for you. You're not choosing to delay, you're forced to delay. So in that situation, I would, if you're working in a project management framework, look to the leader of the project and talk about how this could delay the overall time frame. And if the circumstances are even outside of the project team's overall control, like a lot of our stuff depends on legislation, budget. Look at how the budget has, we've been in a CR this whole fiscal year, and that has implications on the work that we can get accomplished. And that is unfortunately out of our control. So if that is the case where it is so high above you that it's out of your control, you'll have to do some mitigation efforts, some risk management in that case. But if it's more internal, if it's more a smaller problem within the project team itself, have an open conversation. Talk to the project lead, talk to the person, ask if there's anything you can do to support moving the efforts forward so that you can all be successful. And in that case, I think having that open and honest conversation will be your best approach if the delay is within the team's control.
Thank you. And that actually ties into some of the previous comments that we saw back in the beginning of this session that I wanted to mention, just because they really drew a lot of connections to some of the other concepts that we teach about in SEEDS often, like emotional intelligence, for instance. This is all about our self-awareness, figuring out why we procrastinate, and our self-management, what we can do about that. And of course, our relationship management plays into this, but a lot of folks brought up things like feeling imposter syndrome or analysis paralysis. Maybe they're new to VBA and they don't know who to go to or where to find answers. So they are afraid to look uninformed and how that might appear. So that again plays into the level of trust and psychological safety that you may feel on your team. And like we mentioned, having those processes and some clarity of roles and expectations can really help with that. So like you mentioned, sometimes things are outside of our control, but the things that we can do sometimes are knowing specifically what it is that we need to help us move forward and being able to verbalize that so that we can go to our supervisors or our teammates and ask specifically for what it is that we need. Those specifics can save you time by adding that clarity. So maybe when we can find the things that are within our control by knowing ourselves well enough and being able to manage the relationships that are within our circle of control, we can help to move things forward a little bit.
Great. Thank you for that insight, Tammy. And I am loving the regular SEEDS attendees who are drawing themes from all of our courses, all of our content. That is so wonderful to hear that everything is coming together for you. And absolutely, we're going to hit on emotional intelligence or a factor of it here momentarily, but that is important when it comes to recognize your emotions, which is our next potential factor for that may lead to your procrastination. So let's jump into that. Sometimes I feel personally that I avoid tasks that stir up negative or difficult emotions within myself. And it's no surprise that if you feel doubtful, anxious, bored, or stressed about work items, you may tend to avoid them because you don't want to sit in that emotion, that difficult feeling. The avoidance may tend to be heightened during times of uncertainty or times of overwhelm. And when you're feeling this way, even the simplest tasks, such as responding to an email, can seem daunting. I know I've had different phases of my career where there's been a lot on my plate, personally and professionally, and I was feeling so overwhelmed in those moments that I would just freeze up, unsure of which task I should tackle next, how I can feel more accomplished throughout the day. And using some of these strategies that we'll talk about today have really helped me overcome my emotions when I am faced with that feeling of avoidance because of the difficult feeling. So if you're unsure if it's your emotions that are playing into one of the reasons that you choose to procrastinate, ask yourself the following questions, and we'll do a little bit of reflection here. Again, this is in your handout, but if you don't have the handout, the questions will be posed right here on the slide. So first of all, how's your mental health? Do the tasks that you avoid inspire certain emotions within yourself? What do those tasks make me feel? So again, go ahead and take a few moments to think on this, and we'll come back to recap in about 45 seconds. All right, I already see some thoughts flowing into the chat. If you're comfortable, feel free to share those. If not, just jot them down for your own reference. I'm seeing a lot of people feel overwhelmed, having a fear of failure, being annoyed that you're not qualified to do the task, anxious, exhausted, emotional gas tank is empty. So many difficult feelings, tired, overworked, getting anxiety if there's a bad review. Absolutely. That can be really just defeat our whole morale. So I can absolutely relate to a lot of the comments here. Thank you all for sharing and being so vulnerable here in the chat. And absolutely, I'm seeing some things about family issues. So our personal lives and the things we're going through outside of work absolutely play a role in how we show up to work. So don't discredit that, and don't feel like we're all robots and we can just turn off that side of ourselves. And we have to recognize and have that empathy for ourselves as well, which actually self-compassion is something that we'll talk about in the upcoming slides. Wow, thank you all so much for sharing and being so vulnerable. I really appreciate those insights. And again, hopefully with this reflection, you have an understanding of whether or not these difficult feelings play into your procrastination as we jump into some strategies for addressing our emotions. So the first strategy, if this impacts you, is to disentangle your feelings. Now, I know that's easier said than done, but let's think about what that might mean. In her Harvard Business Review article, Alice Boyce says that accurately identifying your emotions will help you to manage them. Now, this is what I was referring to when I mentioned emotional intelligence earlier, and Tammy mentioned that. We've been hearing that in the chat. Self-awareness is a huge pillar of emotional intelligence. And if you can grow that skill within yourself, you can help build your ability to recognize what you're feeling, put a name to it, and work to address it. That's a huge thing. So don't discredit the fact that you were able to recognize in the chat, in your reflection, what you're feeling already. That shows your emotional intelligence is strong. So once you recognize these feelings, it's helpful to analyze how much each of these emotions you've identified is affecting your attitude toward your tasks at hand. For example, when I look at my emotions related to my workload, and I look back at the themes throughout all of my years with VA, I find a recurring issue when it comes to writing any sort of substantial document or presentation. And I think this even goes back to college, writing term papers, research papers. I would never want to face it head on. I would put it off till the very last minute in college. And in the workplace, this often produces a anxiety on the level of 7 for me when we're talking about a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most severe. And once I was able to recognize this pattern within myself and to what degree I was feeling it, I felt more in control of the moment and my choice to put off these writing assignments in favor of tasks that were more easily accomplished, more easily checked off the to-do list. And I came to understand that it was really the large scale of these writing assignments, the course builds, the creation of standard operating procedures that led to me feeling overwhelmed. So what I've done instead is, instead of looking at the end goal as the only goal, I've broken those types of assignments into smaller milestones. And so then I have smaller chunks of work to achieve and things feel more obtainable. So on top of knowing the emotion, also being able to rate the intensity of that feeling can help you evaluate how your management of your emotions has shifted over time. If you are able to implement some strategies successfully, and in 3 months, your severity level of that feeling has decreased, that's progress. Feel proud of that progress and know that your efforts are getting results and you are really on the right path to helping yourself grow in this area. So when tasks involve a specific difficult emotion, such as a high level of boredom, some things that you might consider to do are scheduling a reward for completing that task. Maybe you have a small favorite snack or food at the end of that. You have something to look forward to and say, oh, I finished that task. Now I can have some Dove chocolate or something else that's delicious for you. Or you could accomplish the work in a more fun way, like pairing up with a teammate who has similar work to do, and you can share ideas about how to best accomplish this. There's creative ways that you can think about accomplishing a task that don't have to make it seem bored forever. Be innovative. Think about ways you can get the work done in a more enjoyable fashion if boredom is the emotion that you're feeling. So when a task involves emotions such as anxiety, start with the parts that make it the least apprehensive, and progress from there. So like I said, my large writing assignments and course builds, I now have that framework for myself where I start with compiling the research and the analysis of the resources. And really that's the most interesting and enjoyable part for me. And then I can create an overarching design of the final product that I'm looking to build, a storyboard of sorts of how I envision the final product. And by that point, I've had 2 major successes. I've gathered my resources, I've created a storyboard. My next step is to build out the final product. And that feels so achievable at this point because I've already celebrated my 2 successes and I know what the next steps will be. Psychologist Todd Kashdan and his team refer to this process as psychological flexibility. So the more you use this concept of breaking things down and looking for those smaller successes, the happier and healthier and high-performing you'll be. Jesse, if we could go back a couple of slides, I think we got off pattern here. Okay, great. So let's talk about now, we talked about disentangling your feelings. Let's talk now about using self-compassion. So this is the second approach for dealing with a situation where your emotions may be what is interfering with your procrastination. And before we talk about self-compassion, let's first talk about what do we mean by compassion. Compassion is offering understanding and kindness to others when they fail or make mistakes, rather than judging them harshly. So when we refer to self-compassion, that simply means providing the same understanding and kindness to our own self. Now, you might be wondering, how can self-compassion help me from procrastinating? Well, if you've ever struggled or failed with a particular situation in the past, your past struggle may be influencing your decision to delay going down a similar path now. Let's look at an example. Say that you apply for a new position, and it's a role that you're really interested in and excited about the prospect of potentially obtaining. You thoroughly prepare yourself for the interview and you feel confident when the interview begins. However, as the questions begin rolling in, they were nothing like the questions you had anticipated. So you leave the interview already having a sense that you didn't get the job. You feel defeated and disappointed in yourself. Well, those negative emotions from that experience can easily spill into your mind anytime a new job prospect comes around, since you want to avoid experiencing that past failure again. You put off applying for that new role. In reality, that pattern is trying to protect yourself from feeling that difficult emotion, where our minds are trying to protect ourselves, but we're really just keeping ourselves from growing. So instead of dwelling on the negative instance, show yourself some compassion about that experience and release any judgment you might be holding against yourself. We all make mistakes. What's important is not to let your past failures hold you back from the growth that you seek. Another way to think of it is, imagine a friend was coming to you and telling you about this experience of really messing up that interview in the past, and they really want to apply for this new job, but they're hesitant. As their friend, I can't imagine anyone would say to them, well, you really bombed that last one. I don't know why you think you'd do any better this time. A friend wouldn't say that to their friend, but sometimes we say those things to ourselves. And how self-defeating is that? We unfortunately have inner monologues, inner mean girl for me, something I've worked to overcome over the years, inner dialogues that kind of play on repeat, talking ourselves down. But if you can learn to flip the script and get yourself out of that spiral that leads you to avoid equating your past experience with any future possibilities, you can face those new experiences head on and feel confident that you're capable of performing differently in the future. So here's a sample script of some self-compassion that you might deploy. I've been disappointed with my performance in the past, and that's making me hesitant. That's a normal and understandable feeling, but I was a beginner then, and I'm not now. It's okay to learn through experience. So something as simple as that can really help lift you out of that negative cycle of thinking that because you failed in the past, you're gonna fail again in the future. And that's a hard thing to overcome, but it's worth working on because you're worth working on. Okay, so let's move on to our third and final factor that could be causing procrastination within us, and that is our thought patterns. So perhaps you find that some areas of your work you are quite disciplined in, but in other areas you struggle quite a bit. This might be due to your thought patterns or cognitive blocks in particular areas when you struggle. And some of these cognitive factors are universal. For example, oftentimes if we get a task and the deadline is 4 weeks in the future, we tend to underestimate how complex that task really is. We think, oh, I've got 4 weeks to work on it. I'll look at it in 2 weeks because I've got other more pressing things to do. Well, 2 weeks pass, you look at the task and you realize, oh gosh, I wish I had those other 2 weeks that I didn't do anything to make progress. So that's a pretty common thought pattern of just underestimating how complex a task is. But some of the cognitive blocks might be a little bit more personal. So for me personally, one of the cognitive blocks that I often face is related to positive feedback. So when somebody gives me positive feedback about a presentation I delivered, rather than just saying thank you, sometimes that can lead me to spiral into an indication of, well, they only commented on that presentation. Did that mean my 4 previous presentations weren't good enough? Did I not meet the expectation? And when I'm faced with building a new presentation, my mind just kind of replays that scenario in my head and puts me in knots about moving forward, and really leads to choosing to delay or do more easily accomplished tasks now so that I don't have to have that inner dialogue. So you can see how that pattern is keeping me from moving forward and getting the work accomplished efficiently, even though I had just received positive feedback. So maybe some of these patterns are within yourself, and we've got some questions on the screen here to do our next reflection activity. So take a moment to think, does the task that you're putting off feel more difficult than the steps actually are? Do I enjoy or at least get a sense of satisfaction from the task once I start? We'll take a few seconds here to respond. All right, I'm seeing a lot of agreement here in the chat, a lot of yeses to both, that you agree that the task feels more difficult than it actually is. So that's an indication like we're kind of messing with ourselves there. We've got some narrative, some dialogue going on in our head that is causing this to be more difficult than it actually is. And especially if you actually enjoy it or get a sense of satisfaction from getting the task done. This is going to be a big one for you if you agree with most of those. So let's go ahead and take a look at some strategies for how you can overcome procrastination if you find that your thought patterns are what's blocking you here. So the first strategy is something, it seems a little bizarre, I'll say at first, and the author even agreed when she suggested this strategy that it wasn't something she regularly practiced, but after learning more about it, she finds it quite helpful. And this is called reversed brainstorming. So basically, when you're looking at a task before you, in your mind, you kind of come up with the worst case scenario about what could go wrong, what could make this task impossibly difficult to accomplish. Maybe you're already doing that because you are always running to the worst case scenario anyways. So if that's the case, or if you can come up with these things of what parameters, what requirements would make this task impossibly difficult. Now, once you have those in mind, think about the opposite of those things. Think about the opposite of the worst thing that could happen and realize like the things that you just listed off as being the most difficult parameters aren't actually the case. Maybe it's more likely that the opposite of that is what you're faced with. And just kind of that shift in what's actually going on before you can help you see that the task is a little, it's less monumental than you're making it out to be. Let's put this to an example because I think this might help apply the concept better. Imagine that you got an assignment and the parameter and the expectation was that you completed this assignment perfect on the very first time. That can be nerve-wracking. It can make you feel very anxious. You could just take a long time to get it done anyways because you feel like it has to be perfect. Now, the opposite of being perfect and submitting a perfect product is making mistakes along the way and incorporating feedback from others to develop the best possible product. So now that you've kind of thought through both of these parameters, the task should cognitively seem a little bit easier than it was originally. And if you accept that missteps and imperfections will occur along the way compared to the previous parameters, you can give it a shot and dive right in. Now, another way to think of reverse brainstorming is to think about, again, looking at something that you've successfully accomplished in the past and pulling out the process you used for that and apply it to whatever it is you're faced with today. We talked about that process earlier, but similar to reverse brainstorming, it could apply here if you have that cognitive block. The second strategy related to your thought process and overcoming that is to learn to accept friction-filled work. So what we mean by friction-filled work is just that stuff that doesn't come as easily to us. We really have to put in a lot of effort to accomplish it, a lot of thought, a lot of decision, a lot of organization. But that's really where the growth is. When we're constantly engaging in tasks that are easy, that are mindless because we're so good at them, we're not growing. But if we can get used to this friction-filled work, that's where our growth can really happen. So newer, more difficult work is what we mean by friction-filled work. It's often the new and difficult work, which that can cause stress and we might lead us to delay on it. But if you can get used to that feeling of being challenged, of having a little bit of tensity in the process while you learn, you can, again, really grow and overcome the thought in your back of your mind that, oh, I can't do this. This is too challenging. So I'm going to put it off till when I have more willpower. But if you can, again, kind of sit in that difficult emotion, that's where your growth will happen. And lastly, another very successful strategy here would be to limit your work to short periods. A lot of times we might feel like we need a long, drawn out work session to get things accomplished. And this can stem from self-criticism and guilt over lost productivity in the past, but that lost productivity is a sunk cost. It shouldn't be given consideration into your current actions. The prospect of all-day tasks end up usually being triggering of even more procrastination. So the first strategy I'll offer you is the 10-minute rule. Whatever it is before you, plan to work on it for 10 minutes today, and then maybe pick it up again tomorrow. Doing bite-sized pieces of the work can get you over that initial emotional hump to start the task, and then you could be well on your way. The second approach is what's called the 90-minute rule, where you plan to, again, similarly to the 10-minute rule, but set aside 90 minutes. And this might be if you're already in the habit of doing regular deep work, the 90-minute rule might be for you. So consider if just really focusing on the task for those 90 minutes and seeing how much you can get done with that intense focus will feed into your success and help you understand that the task is achievable. All right, so we covered quite a few strategies. We covered 7 so far related to those 3 factors of procrastination. So I'd like to just touch on a few more quick tips before we do our review and final reflection. Tackle the difficult task first. You've heard the quote, the cold water doesn't get warmer if you jump in late. So just jump on in and get it out of the way. Get in the habit of creating a plan to approach your day the night before. That can help you rest easier and wake up with a clear mind. And whenever possible, if you're in a leadership role or a project management position, delegate tasks where appropriate. Get your team involved. Team members like to be involved and have that say in things outside of their daily routine work. Get in the habit of creating to-do lists. I know with all of the technology at our fingertips, sometimes we feel like things need to be innovative and the latest technology, but a good old-fashioned Post-it note on your desk with your things that you want to accomplish that day, even if it's just your top 3 things, that can be a huge motivator. And then lastly, the salami technique. Instead of trying to get everything done in one sitting, over time, break up the items to increase the chances of getting it accomplished, much like the 10 and 90-minute rule. So the idea here is to divide the project into smaller pieces, just like a slice of salami, where the name of this technique came from. All right, so let's go on to our review just to recap what we touched on today. Again, we learned about 3 major causes of procrastination, and we talked about strategies for addressing each of those. First, our habits. If we don't have good structure, what are some things we can do? We can schedule our deep work consistently. We can create a system for starting new tasks so we don't have to reinvent that every time. If our emotions are getting the best of us, try to separate your feelings from the work itself. Try to use self-compassion when you're facing a moment of finding things from your past that cause you to replay these narratives in your head of negative self-talk. Show yourself a little bit of that compassion. And then lastly, thoughts. If your thoughts are getting in your way, you can do some reverse brainstorming. You can accept that friction-filled work is going to come your way, and that's how you grow. And then lastly, break your work into short periods. All right, so going on to our final slide, I just want to point out, I invite you to reflect on the things that you learned from today and commit to something that you will do. I want to offer some time for questions. I'm going to invite Tammy to come back on camera and see if we had any questions in the chat. But please do not forego this reflection. Take some time right after this class, jot down some things that you want to commit to and really lean into that. So Tammy, any questions or great conversation from the chat that you'd like to recap?
As always, of course, everyone's concerned about the slides and the resources. They want those, and those will be available to you. They'll be available on our seed site, and you may have already received them in your email as well. But we did have some really good comments back in the thoughts section, someone mentioned sometimes it's all about just being there for each other, like the Breakfast Club movie. So we can really provide a lot of support for one another, even in this virtual world. And sometimes just having someone to reach out to can be a big help when you're feeling that stress and anxiety. And another person mentioned when those disappointments and things happen, to help rewrite your story. Just think that maybe something isn't meant for you right now at the moment. And what can you learn about, and how can you grow from that experience to help yourself stay out of that negative space? Because as another person mentioned, it's easier to believe the negative than the positive sometimes. So it's up to us to try to find ways to break that habit. And we got some more really good strategies, using Alexa to remind yourself to take breaks for your mental health, to get up and walk around every now and then, taking some time in the morning or evening, as you mentioned, to review for the day, and maybe sometimes having those challenging discussions with your supervisor when deadlines are not realistic, and asking for a review of those deadlines if the expectations are not feasible. Lots of good stuff.
Wonderful. Thank you all for those great comments. We actually had a very connecting team meeting earlier today where we all recognized one another for the support we've been offering each other. It was just so great to see how we can support each other in this virtual world, as Tammy mentioned. So any of these topics, like I said at the start, this could be challenging. This is going to ask you to look within yourself, but that doesn't mean you have to do it alone. So build your network, rely on your peers, reach out to people who may have similar workloads and ask them for their guidance and input. That's so valuable to make those connections and learn from each other. So don't feel like you have to do this alone. I will be sending out the slides and handouts once again to those who were in the live Teams meeting, and I saw the link to our Seed SharePoint placed in the chat, and you can catch the recording, and those resources there should be up by tomorrow. So appreciate everybody being here. If there's anything that you want to chat through, please feel free to reach out to me via Teams. I would love to hear from you. We have a survey that we would love for you to fill out, just so we can get a sense of how the course went for you today, what we can do better in the future. And I'll also include that link in the email that I send out shortly after this course. But thank you again so much for your time. I appreciate your participation and vulnerability, and wish you all the best.